Dig into the president's claims now with Congressman Adam Schiff, the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, and Stewart Baker, who was Assistant Homeland Security Secretary for Policy under President George W. Bush. He was also General Counsel at the National Security Agency from 1992 to 1994. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. Welcome to you both. Mr. Schiff, my first question is for you. What's your response to the president's request that the Intelligence Committee take this question, whether or not there was any potentially politically motivated investigation, investigative branch powers were abused, whether that happened, into your investigation of ties between Russia and the Trump campaign? And have you spoken to Chairman Nunes about this yet?
I have not had a chance to discuss it with the chairman, but look, I think this whole allegation the president has made is reckless, and given that it comes without any substantiation whatsoever, breathtakingly reckless. We already know from Director Clapper that under the agencies that he was overseeing in the Intelligence Committee, there was no FISA warrant directed at Mr. Trump or his campaign. Yes, we could bring him in before our committee and have him repeat in closed session the same thing he said privately. And if the reports are correct that Director Comey has said the same thing and asked the Department of Justice to push back on this, then it's clear there was no criminal wiretap. And that is a simple matter to resolve as well. But I think the call for this to be investigated is much like the president's call to investigate his claim that millions of undocumented immigrants voted. It's patently absurd, and it's designed, I think, to give some patina respectability to a claim that really has none at all.
Mr. Baker, breathtakingly reckless, patently absurd. What do you say?
Yeah, I don't understand that. We know from multiple reports, including the New York Times, that there were intercepts and there were FISA orders in connection with Russian efforts to influence the campaign. And we know from Mike Flynn's resignation that those intercepts covered conversations that members of the campaign had. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, let's investigate that. What we've heard from former Obama administration officials are very limited non-denial denials. That is to say, the president says, I didn't order anything. Well, of course he doesn't, but the Justice Department and the FISA court could have. We have Jim Clapper saying, we didn't target the campaign or Mr. Trump. There's a lot of other people that could have been targeted that would look pretty political if it was done in bad faith. I think it's fair to ask the question, what are the facts? And that's what your committee is for.
Mr. Schiff, you say that there was no surveillance whatsoever that might have captured some communications between people close to Mr. Trump?
No, that's not what I've said, and I think what Mr. Baker has addressed is really not what the president tweeted, which was that the president had wiretapped his campaign. It is entirely possible, and I can't comment on what we have been hearing in the committee, that as part of our foreign intelligence gathering directed at foreign spies, that we may have intercepted communications between Russians or between Russians and Americans. But frankly, if that's the case, then the president has a big problem, because why would Trump campaign people be talking to the Russians if that was the context in which communications were gathered? So I'm not saying that that's the case, but if what Mr. Baker is referring to is our efforts to target Russian targets, that's something very different than what the president alleged. And I think for the president of the United States to make this kind of an allegation about his predecessor, I think in the eyes of the rest of the world and our own citizens, really brings discredit on himself and on our very democracy.
Mr. Baker, is there anything nefarious about that? If they were targeting Russians and they captured communications with people close to Trump in that process?
In my view, we had to do that. If the Russians are messing with our elections, we cannot tolerate that. We need to know, and we need to take action against it. At the same time, opening this investigation of one campaign in the middle of an election has enormous political consequences, and it's fair to ask the question, were those political consequences part of the determination to and that is something that ought to be looked at along with the Russian attempt to influence the election.
Mr. Schiff, is that a legitimate question for the committee to be looking into?
Well, I think if you look at the facts here, actually much of the criticism, frankly, that I have leveled and others is that the Obama administration did too little during the course of the Russian interference in our election, not too much, that the Obama administration, in fact, was so wary about being perceived as trying to put its hand on the scales or interfere in the election that they were very reluctant to even call out Russia on what was so plain to the intelligence agencies. Indeed, Senator Feinstein and I had to take the unusual step of doing that ourselves before the Intelligence Committee was ready to do that or willing to do that. So I think quite the contrary. If the Obama administration erred here, and I think they did, it was in not calling this out earlier, not seeking sanctions along with our allies earlier.
I think you can believe that the President Obama was not sufficiently tough with the Russians and still believe that he was determined to be aggressive with the Trump campaign. He does take domestic politics very personally. The FISA system is set up to provide protection for our civil liberties by ensuring that the decision to use FISA is at the highest levels of government, which it turns out, of course, are all political appointees. And in the context of an election investigation, that's just not comforting. I don't think that the president is going to be satisfied to hear, oh, no, President Obama didn't wiretap you, Sally Yates did.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Stewart Baker, Representative Adam Schiff, thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure we'll be returning to this topic again.
It was a pleasure.